Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day one of our Introduction to Statistics unit. All right, today we're going to be talking about what is data analysis. All right, statistics itself is the science of data. All right, the amount of data available can be overwhelming. However, every data set that's gathered is trying to tell a story about a group of individuals. All right, the individuals described in a data set may be people, animals, or things. Right, the characteristics that we measure for each individual are called variables. And the distribution of a variable tells us what values the variable takes and how often it takes those values. For that group's story to be told through their distribution of data, we need to organize, display, and summarize, as well as ask questions about the data in context. Right? That's the essence of data analysis. That's our main focus as we're going through this course. Right, now, what kinds of statistical studies may we come across? All right, so every statistical study starts with a question. We gather data because we're curious about the world around us and whether our perceptions are accurate. Once we verbalize our question, write it down and actually give life to it, we can then determine the most appropriate method for collecting the necessary data. All right, there are two types of studies that can be completed to gather data: observational studies and experiments. Now, observational studies observe individuals and measure variables of interest, but they don't attempt to actually influence the responses. Right? Observational studies can be used to describe a group or situation, compare groups, or to examine relationships between variables. All right, so you're not trying to apply a treatment, you're just observing what's pre-existing. Now, what conclusions can be drawn from an observational study? Well, that depends on how the data was gathered. Data can be collected from the population of interest as a whole or from a sample group. Right? The population in a statistical study is the entire group of individuals that we want to find information about. Right? If you take a census, that means that you're gathering data from all individuals in the population of interest. You can summarize and answer questions about that specific population. If you take a census in multiple populations, you can compare and contrast distributions of the same variable in those populations. Now, when it's not practical to gather data from all individuals in a population, statisticians gather data from a smaller subset of the population called a sample. And you can imagine that if you have millions of people in your population, or even thousands like here in the high school, we may not actually be able to get answers from every single one of them. Right? That's when we try to take a sample. A sample is the part of the population from which we actually collect information. Right? Now, sometimes we try to gather information from a lot of different people, but not all of them respond. All right, so the sample itself is the part that we received information, not the part we reached out to. All right, statisticians can use the information they gather from a sample group to draw conclusions about the entire population as long as an appropriate random sampling method was used. When sampling is done incorrectly, the data gathered is too flawed, it's too biased to allow the statistician to draw conclusions about the population of interest. There is no calculation that can save bad data. If your data collection method is flawed, throw it out and start over. All right, so you have to make sure that you're sampling correctly if you decide to take a sample. For the most part, we're going to focus on taking a census rather than a sample. Right? If you go on to a basic statistics course, then you would learn how to do appropriate random sampling. Right? Unlike observational studies, an experiment deliberately imposes some treatments on individuals to measure their responses. Right? For the data gathered in an experiment to be usable, the principles of experimental design, comparison, control, random assignment, and replication must be adhered to. Now, what do those principles actually mean? You have to be able to compare multiple groups, so you need some sort of control group or baseline group in order to be able to compare. You need to try to control variables that are not part of your treatments. Right? You don't want things changing that could kind of mess with your ability to tell whether your treatments are effective or not. Right? Those are called lurking variables and confounding variables. Right? Random assignment. Right? You have to randomly assign your treatments to your treatment groups. And then replication, we want to either have enough participants or repeat the study multiple times to be able to see if we can actually replicate our results. And now, an observational study is a poor way to gauge the effect changes in one variable may have on another variable. Right? To see the response to change, we need to impose the change ourselves, which means performing an experiment rather than simply observing what is there. Right? That's how we can try to eliminate the potential for lurking variables, essentially variables that could cause our effect instead of our treatments. We want to try to control as much as we can, and we need to be the ones imposing whatever changes that are occurring. Now, when our goal is to understand cause and effect, experiments are the only source of fully convincing data because those are the ones where we're imposing the change. Right? Once the data necessary to answer our question of interest has been gathered, we can complete a surface exploration called exploratory analysis to determine if there's anything interesting within our data set that would warrant further study. All right, now, what kind of data can we actually gather from our studies? All right, so how can we explore a situation using data? What kind of data is appropriate for a given situation? These are the questions that we're going to be exploring throughout the unit. In statistics, there are two types of variables. We have quantitative and qualitative, which is also called categorical. Quantitative variables take numerical values for which it makes sense to take an average. Right? So in other words, we list the values that quantify specific measurements such as age, weight, length, duration, amount, etc. And it makes sense to calculate an average age, average weight, average length. This is what makes those variables quantitative. So when you're trying to figure out, is it a quantitative variable, does it make sense to take an average? Qualitative, also known as categorical variables, place individuals into one of several groups or categories. All right, so here's some examples. We can count the number of M&Ms of a specific color. We can record the number of students with eyes of different colors. We can identify the number of students attending East High by graduating class. All of these variables describe a characteristic or quality that can be categorized. Right? The frequency with which we observe an object or individual with a specific characteristic can be tallied. Right? I mean, we can actually count up how many times we observe that specific characteristic. This is what makes the data qualitative rather than quantitative, even though we sometimes use numbers to describe a common characteristic, such as the year a student is expected to graduate. If it doesn't make sense to take an average, the variable's qualitative, not quantitative. Right? That's your test. Does it make sense to take an average? That separates qualitative from quantitative variables when they're both numerical. And it's important to recognize whether your data is quantitative or qualitative because each type of data has its own graphs and summary statistics that are used to describe these distributions. All right, so I would like for you to answer this question as it pops up in Edmodo. Is a student's height quantitative or qualitative? In other words, categorical. What about a student's hair color? Right? Is a student's height qualitative or quantitative? How about a student's hair color? What would you decide those variables, what would you call those kinds of variables? All right, now that we know the difference between quantitative and qualitative or categorical variables, how do we begin analyzing the data? We're going to answer these questions and more in the next lesson. All right, for your assignment, all right, for the purposes of our in-class activities, you are going to take a census, so you're going to survey all of your class to gather data that you will then analyze. So I need you to consider 2 survey questions that you would like to ask your class tomorrow that are both appropriate and straightforward. All right, the data you gather needs to be quantitative for both questions. The first question should require a whole number response, and the second question should require a numerical measure and response. So the first question, I need it to be a positive number, no decimals. The second question, you could have fractions, you could have decimals as your measurements, but it needs to be a numerical measurement. All right, don't forget to specify the unit of measurement required for your second question. All right, seat partners within each group will compare questions during the first 5 minutes of class to identify the 2 questions you will use for your survey. All right, so use the space down here to kind of brainstorm the topics for your survey questions, and then you're going to compare during class, and we'll be starting with that in the morning. I'll see you in class.